right? The key question is, would you rather respond to a tragedy or prevent that tragedy from happening in the first place? And in some areas, particularly as it relates to child safety, as it relates to safety in our schools, and as it relates to safety in our organizations, the evidence is clear that we can do a substantial amount of things to prevent violence from happening in the first place. And the good news is it's really not that difficult.
I don't call you Agent Hart anymore, do I?
No, just call me Doug. That's fine.
Doug.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Doug. I appreciate you. You were in the FBI for 27 years. You're still engaged in law enforcement. You have seen pretty much the worst of the worst, and you have come around not any other way than, hey, we need to work on prevention. Yeah, we can always prosecute. Yeah, we can always show up with bigger guns. We can show up faster. But that's really limited if we're not preventing the issues, be that crimes against children or issues in schools, all of that.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so talk to me about this, because so much of the conversation nationally around all types of different, even in Idaho recently, I was watching a small clip. There was a bill introduced that would have increased the punishment for essentially predators, child predators, right? And if, I don't really want to go into all the details of the bill, but there was this discussion of like, we need to make the punishment more extreme. And it's like, okay, great. Like, that's fine, right? Let's have that discussion and let's figure out what works. But that's still after the fact, right? And you dealt with a lot of these horrible types of cases, and you're now focusing more on prevention. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So, as I went through my law enforcement career, you see a lot of response or reaction by law enforcement to crime. That's the nature, right? Somebody calls 911 because something's happened. The police show up and they deal with, they respond to whatever's happening. That is the normal course of business. Sure. I spent most of my career in violent crime, drugs, and gangs. And it was towards the latter part of my career that the last 7 years of my career, I was the supervisor for the FBI for the southern 34 counties of Idaho. So I had a large area to cover and not a lot of people to cover that. And in that capacity, every threat that would come to the FBI across the nation for the southern Idaho region would come to me, every single one of them. And so I began to be immersed in dealing with threats of pending violence on a daily basis. Some were insubstantial, others were quite severe. And so I began to think about this in a different way in terms of, how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place, right? The key question is, would you rather respond to a tragedy or prevent that tragedy from happening in the first place? And in some areas, particularly as it relates to child safety, as it relates to safety in our schools, and as it relates to safety in our organizations, the evidence is clear that we can do a substantial amount of things to prevent violence from happening in the first place. And the good news is it's really not that difficult. And so that's really my message, is that for far too long, for decades and decades, we as a society, as a nation, have not been paying attention to the evidence that exists, the hard data that would point us in the right direction as it relates to violence prevention.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com. Okay, so talk to me about prevention then, because before we went live with mics, what we were talking about a myriad of things. and specifically, there was a shift from how we let our kids play. In fact, I was at my local elementary school park just the other day,
Mm-hmm.
and there were like 8 kids there, and it was I think it was Saturday afternoon. It was like 4 o'clock or something, and these 2 kids just left together. They were young, like, second, third, fourth grade. They just left together and went somewhere. And an adult came out and said, "Hey, where did, your brother go?" And the older sister said, "Oh, he left with what's his name to go to what's his name's house." She's like, "Okay, you just let him leave?" And she was like, "Yeah, he just lives around the corner, right?" And of course, the fourth grader was
Yeah.
innocent enough. And I was speaking with the mom, and she said, "Yeah, I mean, what is this, the 90s? You can't just walk away." And I laughed about it. It's like, God, that's an astute point. It really was, again, as you confirmed, it really was around the 90s that we started looking at child safety. It's always been every parent's number one priority, but we started viewing child safety and how we relate to the environment in our neighborhoods differently.
Yeah.
Like, what was that?
Well, it's really a manifestation of us across the board, and this we'll start with children and their safety, but it exists in our schools and our organizations of responding to fear rather than responding to evidence. And when the fear dictates our response, and fear is not a negative, fear prompts us to action, which can be good, but sometimes that action or the decisions we make based on fear are not in keeping with or not in proportion to or completely opposed to reality. So let's take kids, for instance. I'm part of a group called Save My Family, and we go and speak about families and children and all of the negative things that can impact a child in today's society as they're growing up, such as technology and video games and so forth. My role in this group is to talk about the physical, child predators and the other dangers that children can encounter in today's world. That's what I dealt with when I was with the FBI and continue to deal with today in other capacities. Roughly in sometime in the 90s, with the advent of the internet and mass media, studies have shown that parents stopped letting their kids play outside. When you and I grew up, I used to ride my bike to school.
Right.
I mean,
Everywhere. Yeah.
everywhere. From the time I was a little kid, I had far more freedoms than I've ever allowed my own children to have, because I can fall prey to this as well. But studies have shown that decision came about at the same time as these child abduction cases were, a child abduction case in, Georgia or Minnesota or wherever it would be now is known to us in Idaho, whereas previously that wouldn't have happened, and we didn't have all of the news stations camped on the front lawn and the talking heads just, broadcasting this over and over and over and over again.
That 24-hour news cycle just feeding it over
exactly.
and over.
And so the parents' response was, I've got to protect my kids because somebody's going to come, and a stranger, we call it a stranger abduction. A stranger is going to come and take my kids. Those happen. They're horrific. I've been involved in several of those investigations. They don't usually end well. They are a parent's absolute worst nightmare. It's my worst nightmare as a parent. I've dealt with parents who have lost their children in this way, and it leaves a mark that doesn't go away. But it's very rare. It's a low base rate occurrence. And so we as parents respond to that fear thinking that we're going to keep our child safe, right? Yet we won't think a minute about sending them to spend the night at their friend's house. And so they are statistically, by a massive margin, far more likely to be sexually abused at a sleepover or at a camp or at a sports camp or whatever than they are to be abducted by a stranger. You can't even calculate those statistics. And so we'll respond based on our worst fears, and yet we won't pay attention to the evidence as far as where do our kids really, where are they really exposed to danger? And then we won't give a second thought about putting our child in a dangerous situation because we haven't looked at the evidence.
Right.
And the evidence tells us where we should pay a little more attention.
Right. And this actually came out, I think it was like 15 years ago, somewhere right at the end of the early 2000s and around 2010, there was this big push. There was some degree of gun accident violence, not intended violence, but just like kids getting a hold of guns, horrific stuff again. And I read an article that was saying, hey, look, every time my kid goes over to somebody's house, the first thing I ask is, do you have the gun and is it locked up? Right? She said, look, it's just, this is where we are in the world. And again, to your point, it was a few horrific, very, very well covered incidences of young people dying in accidental gun tragedies. But what she wasn't asking is, do you have a pool and is there a locked fence around it? Right? What she wasn't asking is, are all of your bookshelves secured to the wall? Because, and again, I bring these up because I actually looked up after this, and my wife and I didn't even have kids yet, but I looked it up because I was really curious. Like, this seems extreme, but what do I know? Like, let's find out. Overwhelmingly, the things that kill people under the age of 15 are like suffocation, crushing, pools obviously number one, getting outside of playing in somebody's backyard, ball goes over the fence, you run after the ball, you get hit by a car, like gun death, accidental gun death was so low on that list of things that, but again, we view it so horrifically, as we should, right? Like, that's not great, but we also aren't looking at the data and saying, okay, well, what are the other things that we should reasonably ask before we go ahead and ask these questions? And to your point, you send, I had a neighbor actually moved away, but she never let her kids sleep at somebody's house, which is great. She actually had an experience that as a younger woman, she was over at somebody's house and like the dad appeared at like 2 a.m. in his underwear, like standing over them. And she said it like she never forgot it. It was this horrific thing and nothing happened to her, but she was so freaked out and realizing she was at the mercy of this adult grown man that was like creeping her out. And again, it's just one of those things she never forgot.
Right. And so people need to understand, what is the nature of a pedophile? And pedophiles are incredibly manipulative. They're masterful liars. They're masters of deceit. You probably have a picture of a pedophile in your mind, and I guarantee that profile or that picture isn't accurate. You probably knew your sexual preference at a pretty young age, as do most people, whatever that preference may be. People who are attracted sexually to children know that at a very early age. And so they position themselves. Are you a fisherman?
Yeah, I enjoy fishing, yeah.
Okay. Where do you fish?
I go to the river. I go to the river or the lake.
Okay. I always ask that question, and nobody ever gets it right.
I go where the fish are.
You go where the fish are. Okay?
Got it.
So we're always shocked when it's a pastor or a coach or a daycare worker or a caregiver or somebody in a profession that is surrounded by children. We think, how could that be? And I don't mean to disparage the millions of people who are in those professions for all the right reasons and have none of those proclivities. But that's oftentimes where you're going to find these people because that's where the fish are.
They go with the fish.
And so I just saw an article not too long ago about some parents took their kids on a cruise. And so they passed their kids off to on the cruise ship, there's some sort of daycare thing. And guess what? That's where their kids got abused by somebody who was a worker on the ship. And so what I do is for any parents, I have them ask 2 questions. The first question is, to whom do I give control over my children? Because the fact of the matter is, particularly when we're talking preteen children, when those children are out of your presence and in the presence of another adult, you have effectively given control of your child to that other adult. Agreed?
Agreed.
So you need to ask yourselves, who am I giving my child to? And then the second question is, under what circumstances? If you will answer those two questions and say, what do I know? And we all think we have this radar, like I'm going to know. You don't. Right. I've had colleagues who had incredibly trusted neighbors and friends, and these are people in law enforcement who know this stuff, and their child was abused by a neighbor. You don't know. You can't tell by looking at somebody. You simply can't. And so, who do I give control of my child to, and under what circumstances? And if you will say, I will not allow my child to be alone, I will not put them in a circumstance where they're alone with another adult, then you've eliminated the vast majority of risk that your child is going to be physically sexually assaulted. Now, we can have a whole other discussion about what happens online, about sextortion, and the things that are happening there, which are incredibly prevalent in our society today. Those affect teens more than preteens because of what they're doing online. But again, if I'm the parent of a teenager, those are conversations I'm going to have with my kids, because once you shift from preteen into the teenage world, the dangers also shift a little bit because of the independence of your teenagers. They're less likely to be abused in a similar manner as a small child, but their exposure to danger becomes significantly greater because of their movements and activities, and particularly what they're doing online.
Right. Their willfulness and their resourceful and their capacity to navigate the world are far greater than like a 5-year-old, right?
Yes.
Because if you get a 16-year-old that's being rebellious and can get into a car or escape your house to do whatever that, 16-year-old knows is the right thing to do, you're dealing with a completely different risk arena.
Right. And so let's take, a teenage girl. Date rape. The statistics are incredible as it relates to, and statistics, you got to take them with a grain of salt.
Sure.
But I've seen statistics as high as 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. I mean, that's astounding. But the instances of date or acquaintance rape, of assaults, are very high. Now, I can't count the number of rapes I've investigated. I dozens and dozens and dozens of them. I will tell you this: the one common denominator, almost exclusively in virtually every rape case I worked, alcohol. Okay, so do kids experiment with alcohol? Absolutely. So that's a preventative measure I can take with my kids. Just like those other 2 questions with our preteens, that's a preventative measure. If I can answer those 2 questions, then I can prevent my child from going into these situations where they may be harmed. I can prevent something bad from happening. If I talk with my teenagers about the risks associated with alcohol consumption, and not like just DUI, but like people's behavior changes, their inhibitions go away. When drugs and alcohol get involved, bad things happen, especially to young people who really don't know how to control themselves anyway. And so if I have a teenage daughter, that's a conversation I think you need to have. Let's talk about the risks associated with alcohol consumption.
Right. And very fortunately, I think there are a lot of recommendations that are emerging within, say, the college atmosphere that are very, very positive. One in particular, I was talking to because I was in college prep and admissions for a long time, and I would talk to parents about this. And one big thing that's coming out is young men in particular are getting way more savvy with who they spend time with, who they engage with, how they engage with people. One recommendation, and real good good strategy from not making bad decisions is essentially, look, anytime you're drinking at all, like, under no circumstance should you allow yourself to be around somebody that you're actually interested in, because if you do that, the odds of something bad happening or regretful happening, or you screwing it up, if you really like this girl, don't drink around her,
Yeah.
because you're going to do something, or the odds of you doing something are far greater. So like,
Yeah.
if you really like this girl or whatever, don't engage in these practices around them.
Yeah.
There are things like that that are starting to emerge, and the risk associated with particularly young men. It's like, listen, look, I can speak of myself, okay, and I never raped anyone or anything
Yeah.
like that, but I can tell you that in college I was a worse person when I was drinking, right? And I think there was a large degree of culture around, like, oh yeah, like, boys will be boys, or like, oh yeah, you were athletes and you were young men and you were, but at the same time, it's, look, you have to recognize this is going to deliver a worse you to the world, and
Yeah.
you will not necessarily like the things you end up doing. I know I certainly didn't. Like, I've never been in a normal fight in my whole life, and of course I got into scuffles with people
Sure.
when I was drunk. It was like, why? I'm not somebody that needs to engage in violence, but I found myself in those situations. Like, having that understanding and really trying to produce a culture of, look, there's real risk here.
Yeah.
There's real risk. And it's not just you fighting with your roommate. Like, there's real risk that could lead to real long-term problems for a lot of people if you do this. And I think that kind of wisdom is starting to emerge as more predominant philosophy and things to teach young men, which is great.
Yeah. And on the young men's side, the other piece of it that I think bears mentioning is this phenomenon called sextortion that we're seeing. It's just rampant, and it isn't predators. Sextortion is organized crime.
Right.
It's big business. It's oftentimes, most times, overseas. A lot of it's coming from the Ivory Coast, and but it's having a horrible impact on a lot of young men. We've seen several suicides because they of both young men and grown men, because they'll be online. We know if you're a teenage boy, the odds they're looking at pornography online is
it's like 100%.
It's yeah,
as close to 100% as we could be without being 100%.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they think that they're engaged with some, the love of their life, some beautiful young women. They talk them into, they'll send them photos. They'll receive some explicit photos, and they'll be asked to send some explicit photos in return. And as soon as they do, then they'll say, okay, unless you send me a
$500.
Yeah, and it's usually they know they're dealing with kids, so the amounts are from $300 to $500, $800 depending. But they'll say, we'll send this photo out to everyone on your social media, and they'll show them, we've got your list. And so this is happening. So I got, when I was with the FBI, in Boise, we received one a week of these. In our Salt Lake City headquarters, they received one per day. So these are thousands and thousands. And these young men, put yourself in their position. They've sent an embarrassing, explicit photo to somebody. Now they're faced with, can I confide in my parents? If this gets blasted out to my grandparents, my brothers, my sisters, my friends, they don't have the optic of it'll be okay down the road. And a lot of them take an extreme action based on this. They don't know what to do with it. And so, if you have a teenage boy, this is absolutely a discussion that you as a parent should have with them, so that they understand that the odds are, if they're talking to somebody in that way online, that it is not who they think it is.
Yeah, this particular topic is very near and dear to me. I've been doing a lot of work with Deputy Gomez and other people on trying to help. Like, it's so effective for a couple really specific reasons. One, this is one of the first instances in a long time that I can think of where, like, a 16-year-old guy is a target of violence and extortion. Like,
Yeah.
we all know to protect young women.
Yeah.
We've always protected young women, and
Yeah.
and rightfully so, right? They're preyed upon horribly, right?
Yeah.
And we protect young men and young women when they're little, like they're 4 or 5,
Yeah.
and as we should. But largely the 16-year-old male who's like popular is not the target of crime, right? Like there's no attack vector for those people, right? Like
Yeah.
what are you going to do with them? There was a case in Michigan recently that there were, I think this individual, a 17-year-old boy who was, a popular football player, and he got sextorted by Nigerians, right? I think it was 2 or 3 Nigerians, and they actually extradited him. So they were brought to justice, but this guy committed suicide.
Yeah.
And it was specifically because he was popular and had a following on Instagram. He had like 5,000 followers or something. So it's weaponizing the popularity of the individual that's supposed to be bulletproof at this point. It's like, what are you going to do to me?
Yeah.
All these people like me. I'm big man on campus. And it's exactly because people like you and you're big man on campus that becomes the attack vector for the people. They're like, okay, well, we will extort you again. We're going to blackmail you against this,
Yeah.
right? Because now you've cultivated this great reputation. And this is one of the only ways people can actually go after them and utilize that to get things out of them. It's so horrific
Yeah.
that there's an actual film that I want to shoot with Gomez to portray this effectively to people.
Yeah.
You don't need geographic proximity, right? The predators don't need to be near the person. You don't need temporal proximity. They don't have to be where the person is at a certain time. You also don't need optical, what is the last one? It's optical recognition. Okay, so say somebody comes up to some 16-year-old in Albertsons at the exact time, at the exact location the 16-year-old happens to be. If you walk up to the 16-year-old guy or girl and you're some creepy, weird 50-year-old, they recognize you instantly. They're like, I don't know what you want from me, but like, it's not good. Go away. All you need to do on social media is literally put up like a popsicle stick photo in front of your face and people buy it. It's literally like somebody walks up to you in Albertsons with a popsicle stick photo in front of their face and they're like, hey, I think you're cute. And the 16-year-old buys it. They're like, oh, awesome. It's that much of a veneer. It's nothing. And they're so effective at getting these kids because now it's the world out to get your kid.
Yeah.
They don't need to be close to your kid. They don't need to be around your kid at a specific time. They don't even need to appear to be anything else. They can just put up a photo or 10 photos or 20, however many photos you want, and that person will bite.
Yeah.
It's so horrific. And no one is, I think people are attempting to educate parents, but not sufficiently enough. And the portals to come after these kids are numerous, and they are not just their cell phones.
Oh,
right?
no.
Like they are school administered computers. They are computers in computer labs. They're even library computers, right? Any monitoring device is absolutely fallible, and you can get around it. And speaking with Deputy Gomez, they have cases of that in this area where people are coming after them with school computers. But so talking about sextortion, right? Talking about the attacks on our kids, you're all about prevention, right? And that spans from, preventing crimes against children when they're young, as far as neighbors and sleepovers. You're in the tech space with it. You're in the school safety space with it. How do we prevent these things? How do we get ahead of, all right, let's prosecute harder and let's respond faster? How do we get ahead of that so that we're not having those conversations?
That's a great question. So, and that's what really prompted me. I had time left at the FBI, but I really had a passion for this and wanted to pursue the opportunity to create an organization that is focused on violence prevention in our schools and in our organizations. And so when I left the FBI, I did take another law enforcement job, but a job that allowed me at the same time to work outside of that occupation. And we formed an organization or a company called Threat Zero Solutions. And to answer your question, first you have to understand the problem in its totality before you start implementing solutions. So let's talk about school safety for a minute. I guess we're not quite in March, but in April of 2024, so in a few short weeks, we will have the 25-year anniversary of the Columbine tragedy. 25 years, a quarter century. So one of my frustrations is I think we're out of time for excuses. Columbine was a watershed event in a lot of horrific, we saw this unfold before our eyes. But what a lot of people don't know is that immediately following that event, some phenomenal research was initiated and has continued to this day. So in 2002, the Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education published a study called the Final Report of the Safe Schools Initiative. And it analyzed pretty much every school shooting from the mid-'70s up through the early 2000s. So they did a deep dive, and these are competent researchers. Whatever you will say about the federal government, some things it does well, some things it does very, very poorly, but they do good research. And the research, I think you can rely on it. I think it's solid. And so this report came out in 2002, just 3 years after Columbine. We had our first really big piece of evidence that said, hey, let's pay attention to what are the precursors, what precedes a violent attack? What do we know? What does the data tell us? And that research has continued over time. The Department of Defense did a marvelous study following the Fort Hood attack, and they published their work in 2012. Then the FBI got involved and published a couple of different monographs. One of them is called Making Prevention a Reality. And I love that title because their whole focus is on, hey, there's a lot of evidence out here that tells us how to prevent these things. They then did a study, they called it their pre-attack behavior study, and they told us, here's all the behaviors that are displayed before an attack takes place. And then the Secret Service did another follow-up study, and on and on and on it goes. But if we were to take, let's take K through 12. That's where we're really pushing a lot of the safety initiatives in the state of Idaho, Utah, across the country. Sure. I've heard estimates that we're spending approximately $3.5 billion a year in our country on school safety initiatives. Now, let's look at elementary school, middle school, high school. That's roughly our division in K through 12. The Secret Service did a 10-year study, and they looked at every attack that it took place in a decade, K through 12. How many of those, what percentage of those attacks do you think are in the elementary realm?
Probably fewer than high school. Yeah,
2 to 3% of our attacks are in the elementary, K through 5 or 6, depending on the school space. So that's good news. Those are our most innocent children, are most unable to defend themselves. But that is far and away the lowest percentage. Now, all of these generate a lot of media, but your Sandy Hooks, your Uvaldes, they're unimaginable, and so they get a ton of attention. But the fact is, the attacks in our elementary schools are fairly rare. Middle school, what do you think percentage-wise?
I'm going to go less than high school again, because you have three years instead of 4, plus you have less capable individuals that actually go to that school for students.
Absolutely. So we're looking at about 23% of our school attacks are in middle school. Then we go to high school, and you're at about 72%. So between middle school and high school account for, again, this is hard data. This is the evidence we need to examine. 95% of our attacks in K through 12 take place in middle school or high school. Now, the key question is this, because, well, let me skip one question further.
Sure.
Where do you think we're spending most of our money in school security?
Probably in infrastructure. Infrastructure. So more cameras.
Physical security.
Yeah, right.
physical security. That's
Right.
where the most money is being spent.
Yeah, doors, camera systems,
Yes.
bulletproof glass.
Okay. Designed to keep people
Out.
Right.
Right. When I go
Okay.
volunteer, I have to put, there's
Okay.
a double door system. I have to do the ID, the whole thing.
So let's look at our elementary schools. That 2 to 3% is almost exclusively, virtually 100%, a bad actor coming from off campus. That's an outsider coming to that institution to harm those kids. So I'm a huge advocate of making our elementary schools very, very robust, hard to get into, hard targets. We should really pay attention to that physical security piece in our elementary schools. Let's shift to middle school, high school, where 95% of our attacks are taking place. Who is committing those attacks?
Probably kids from the school.
Yes. So based on data, this is pretty much irrefutable. In the Secret Service study, a 10-year study, 90% of the attacks were committed by a currently enrolled student. So you can spend your millions and your tens of millions on physical security, but you're ignoring what the evidence tells us, which is that the threat in our middle schools and high schools is almost exclusively, and the other 10%, by the way, former students. So
you have almost no off-campus deranged individuals that have no tie to the campus.
That is the point. The physical security is the answer. Physical security is the solution if the attacks are coming from outsiders to our institution trying to get inside. But we're literally locking the fox in the henhouse, because the person statistically most likely to commit an attack in a middle school or high school institution is a currently enrolled student, and they walk past your millions of dollars of security with their key card every single day. So unless we're going to go to the point that we turn our schools into TSA and that our students come through that type of a security check before they enter the school, and we're never that's
nobody wants that.
Nobody
They're
wants
not
that.
Do that.
They're not going to do that. The other thing we need to keep in mind is these are low base rate events. We have to keep a proper perspective. It's just that the impact is so incalculable. It's so horrific, and you don't get over it. And so that's the other thing that is this is a little bit of a tangent, but you have a lot of people in this space that market based on fear and based on inaccurate statistics and based on manipulating statistics to try to make it seem worse than it is. So the statistics that I cite are either Secret Service or FBI or Homeland Security statistics. I don't use the media statistics that are, probably 20 to 50 times more than what you're going to get from these other sources. My message is one of hope. My message is one of empowerment, that we can exert control over something that seems beyond our control. And that's what prevention is. And so I go back to this school realm and say, okay, if we know that 95% of our attacks are going to take place in middle school and high school, and we know that over 90% of the time those attacks are carried out by students,
currently enrolled students, why are we spending tens of millions, even billions of dollars on physical security exclusively and doing nothing in the preventative realm? And then let's talk just for a second about what evidence we have that would indicate prevention is possible, okay? Because that's important to shore that up. In that same Secret Service study, when they looked at all of the attacks in a decade-long period, they found that 100% of the attackers displayed observable concerning behaviors. Let that sink in for a minute. 100% of the people who committed these attacks displayed observable concerning behaviors, to the extent that it should have elicited immediate action. So these are not like, oh, he's having an off day. This is pretty significant behavior. All right, so that's astounding, 100%.
Let me ask you, where do you think they displayed these behaviors?
Probably in some, well, definitely not just at home.
94% of the time they displayed those behaviors at school.
Right.
So we know 100% of the attackers displayed the behaviors. We know 94% of the time they displayed them at school. Now we'll shift over to an FBI study, and guess what they found? That if the attacker was a student, 92% of the time, the person who observed that behavior was another student. 75% of the time, it was a teacher or staff at that school. So, what do we take from that? We know that based on the Secret Service study...
Wait, you said 92 and then 75%.
92% of the time, it's a student.
Another student. And then
75% of the time, the teachers also see that behavior.
Gotcha. So there's crossover there. So it's like teachers. Okay.
There's crossover, but the reason I bring up the students is because we ignore... So
right.
We have a vast intelligence network at our fingertips in our schools, and it's our students, and they want to participate. I've been in front of lots of student groups. They want to be part of this solution. They want to own this part of this problem. They're willing to participate, and we give them nothing. What is the students' role? Lockdown drills. Okay, we're gonna And lockdown drills are important. Statistically, we know if we can prevent an attacker from getting in a room, that people inside that room are generally safe. So I'm not anti-lockdown drills. They're an incredibly important training opportunity for our kids, but they are reactive. They're response. They're not prevention. And so the statistics matter because that's the evidence that we need to use to base our response on, or our decisions on.
Right.
So we know that attackers display these behaviors, and then we also know what those behaviors are. I can tell you chronologically the behaviors, the pre-attack behaviors that are displayed by an attacker prior to an attack.
If I may ask, and I would like to know, that one of the concerns I think that people have with identifying behavior that leads to violence, they don't have a problem identifying the behavior. They're like, yeah, let's figure out whatever it is.
Yeah.
But they're also worried that there's crossover in like, okay, this person is not engaged. This person is not the person who's actually going to commit a crime. They are having an off day, or they are doing these things. So are there behaviors that are almost exclusively or largely like high probability to be displayed by people who are actually committed to doing violence? Or are they like, yeah, because I mean, teenagers are moody and crazy.
Great question.
You know, so what are those behaviors?
So the key thing is that the behaviors, what the studies have shown, is that on average, an attacker will display between 4 and 5 distinct observable behaviors prior to an attack. The good news is this: almost over 90% of the time, those behaviors are displayed at least 3 months in advance of the attack. And more than half the time, they're displayed 25 months prior to the attack. So these aren't people who just snap. The research shows that virtually never happens. These are things that evolve over several weeks or months or even years of time. And so the other thing we keep in mind, because you're absolutely right, teenagers have a wide spectrum of behavior. There is no single behavior that's indicative of violence. So I can't tell you how many times I've gone and taught and lectured on this, and I'll follow my favorite occasion. I was at a Chiefs of Police conference speaking on this subject. They had a paid speaker that they gave the first half of the day to, and I had the second half of the day. And the paid speaker got up and said, I'm going to tell you the cause of these active shooter events in schools, and it's bullying. Well, Matt, how many kids are bullied?
Quite a few.
Almost all of them.
Right.
If bullying was the single cause of attacks in schools, do you think we would subsequently see millions of attacks in schools?
Probably. And that would be a horrific proposition, because then you'd have to like stop the nature of some degree of adolescent growth, right? Like you have hierarchies, and I don't like it. Like I was not a bully. I definitely got bullied by people,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's terrible. And we should do whatever we can to stop bullying. But if you want to say you will never stop school tragedies until you stop bullying, full stop, it's like, well, shit, Doug. Like, look, I'm kind of in trouble.
Yeah. Well, let's take another one: violent media, violent video games. Okay, what's the most so
Everybody who plays Grand Theft Auto is a potential killer, or Fortnite.
What's the most popular video game? Grand Theft Auto. It's vile. It's
right. It's terrible. You're killing prostitutes. You're throwing people out of helicopters. That doesn't make.
It's disgusting.
Right.
But and there are those who would espouse that is the cause. So what I'm saying is this, in answer to your question, there is no single behavior. And so that's why we have to understand all of the behaviors, and we have to understand that a person who is on what we refer to as a pathway to violence, that they will display clusters of behavior. So it's not going to be, I'm just depressed, or I've been bullied, or I'm into violent media. It's going to be, the number one behavior is mental health and wellness issues, not necessarily mental illness, because we want to say, oh, everybody who does this is crazy. It's not the case. But anxiety, severe depression, anger management issues, those types of things are mental wellness issues. Our second biggest behavior is what we call interpersonal interactions. These are people who just can't, they do not get along appropriately in their school or in society.
Right, they're maladapted for social engagement.
The third is called what we call leakage. And leakage is a deliberate or inadvertent disclosure of violent intentions. Okay? That's the kid who's, drawing pictures of schools and guns, or some graphic violent doodle on their homework, or makes a comment online or in a note or in person. That's leakage. We see that quite a bit, and that's our third most common behavior. Our fourth is what we call the quality of their thinking or communication. Is it based in reality? I can show you so many clips of people who have gone on to commit horrible attacks who have said, I'm the most hated person in the world. Well, they aren't. I mean, think about that statement for a minute. They're clearly not the most hated person in the world. They'll talk about how unfair life is for them. That's their perception, but it's not reality. And so we look at the quality of the thinking or communication, and is it based in reality? And then we have other behaviors in terms of suicidality, particularly in young people, that we see that a lot. And so these are people who their lives have gone in such a direction that they're no longer wanting to be alive, and sometimes carrying out their attack. That attack is a way of accomplishing that. We look at physical threat or physical aggression. We look at threats. We look at risk taking. We look at drug and alcohol abuse. And we have this, we can tell you chronologically from most common to kind of least common, these behaviors that are displayed. So that's the good news. That's the evidence. These behaviors are knowable. Now, if the behaviors are knowable, and in that decade-long study, 100% of the attackers displayed these behaviors, then it would stand to reason that a good way to prevent violence from happening would be to teach our teachers and staff and parents and students what those behaviors are, how they're manifested, where they're manifested, when they're manifested. We know all of this. Have you as a parent ever heard any of this?
No.
Okay. That's my point. And so that's why I left the FBI, and that's why we've created a program that does all of those things. That we've created a program for schools and for organizations that teaches the science of prevention through what we call behavioral threat assessment. Because there's this three-step process, essentially. You have to identify and recognize the behavior. You then have to have a mechanism to report that behavior. And that's a big gap for our kids. Kids do not like to tell
Right. Snitches get stitches.
Snitches get stitches. So you have to change that dynamic. In our program, we don't use the word report. We use the word share.
Right.
Because sharing is an act of concern. Sharing is an act of compassion.
Sharing's caring.
Sharing is caring. Okay. And in fact, the FBI uses a phrase that we need to create a culture of shared responsibility. And I absolutely love that, because if I'm a member of an organization, as a student, as a parent, as a teacher, or a company, do I own some portion of responsibility? Is some portion of that on my shoulders to contribute to the health and safety and well-being of that institution and the people that are in there? And I would say yes. And people want that, because that's what gives them some power in this. Right. If knowledge is power, right? I believe that. So if I come to you as a student and say, hey, here's what you need to look for, and it isn't snitching. We talk very candidly about the difference between snitching and sharing. Snitching is to get somebody in trouble. Sharing is that act of care and concern that could save someone's life. And then the third piece is you have to have an assessment mechanism. And that's what's been found, and you'll see this in places where they've had horrific tragedies, Florida, Virginia. Threat assessment teams are mandated in all of the schools after these horrible tragedies.
Sure.
The science of threat assessment has existed for decades, and it's the best preventative measure. So we didn't invent threat assessment, but the key question is what feeds the threat assessment. You can have the best tip line in the world. You can have the best threat assessment capability in the world, but if you haven't taught your population what to look for,
right, to supply data, you can't feed it into the machine.
Exactly.
Right.
100%. And so that's what we've created. That's what we've done with the aim of impacting the safety, the happiness, and the resilience of our kids. Because, as I said earlier, this is a very low base rate occurrence. Now, we've seen an unbelievably high number of suicides in the Treasure Valley amongst our youth right now. So let's talk just a little bit about what's a more common occurrence. So suicide, bullying, sexual harassment, abuse in the home, drug or alcohol problems, okay? If I said, let's talk about suicide. So do you think somebody who's suicidal would display anxiety or depression?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
Right.
Do you think that you would see an appreciable decrease in their school or work performance?
Yes.
Do you think you would see a withdrawal from those activities that were normally pleasurable to them?
Sure.
Do you think they might leak their intent to commit suicide?
Yes.
Okay. These are all the same behaviors that you would see for someone heading down that pathway to violence. So the beautiful part of this philosophy of prevention is that it protects us in the worst case scenario, but it also has a ton in common with the much more frequently seen tragedies in the youth of today, which is suicide, bullying, problem solving, anger management, all of those things. If we're paying attention to behaviors and we're sharing those behaviors and then we can intercede, then we can get these kids help. And so what they found is in schools and institutions where they have these robust threat assessment capabilities, that there's far fewer disciplinary actions, far fewer suspensions and expulsions, and the student population is happier. They're better off because you're identifying these problems. Don't let small problems become big problems. That's what we're talking about. Right. It's just that what I haven't seen is somebody say, okay, I'm going to create an all-inclusive program that takes the burden off of the schools. My wife's been a teacher for several years, and as we developed this, she said, you have to understand the burden of the teachers and the administrators. And I think, honestly, that's probably the biggest impediment to this prevention, is that the volume of the science of the research is such that to say to a business owner, hey, read all the research out there about violence in organizations and come up with your own program to prevent that from happening. Or to the school principal or superintendent, read all the literature out there about preventing school attacks. Bring it all together and then figure out a way to implement it district-wide at an age-appropriate level. It's an impossible task.
Right. The task saturation. I was speaking with an individual about this recently. The number of things we ask our kids, from our schools to do with our kids is so overwhelming. Like
Exactly.
if you, I think it was Lieutenant Sean Harper of Meridian PD. We were talking about Bill 415, which would bring Second Amendment zones to schools, but it's like the number of things we want from our schools, and we don't want to capitulate on academic success at all. It's like, listen, if you want to make the district a public safety expert and fortify the castle expert, like I'm sure the district, West Ada, could do that, but you're not going to get the same emphasis on academics too. Like there's only so much you can do with so many resources and the people that you have in place. You're ultimately going to fall short. And especially when you're talking about something so unbelievably deep, such as psychology and predictive indications with mass tragedies. It's like, how would West Ada be able to effectively root through all of the data and come up with these things?
Right.
It's almost impossible.
Right. And there's one other thing that's at play in this that we've done that I think is very unique in this space, and that is when the Department of Defense did its post-Fort Hood tragedy report, they found that they said one of their findings is that if we can increase the resilience in human beings, their ability to overcome adversity, that's a positive step forward in prevention. So think about the youth of today and the problems they face, and then their problem-solving abilities. So we took that a step further, and part of the organization we formed, we went out and we contacted Dr. Paul Stoltz, and he is a PhD who is the world's foremost expert in adversity and resilience. He's written multiple New York Times best-selling books on that subject. His work is present in 137 countries. He's tested over 5 million people as it relates to how do we, as human beings, better cope with, in a positive way, adversity. How do we become better problem solvers? So when it relates to violence and youth, so many of them feel like they're backed into a corner. This is, right. So if we can make them better problem solvers, if we can help them manage and understand what degree these problems are in their lives, as far as how severe they are, when they can overcome them, how they can overcome them. So as we were putting together all of our content for identifying behaviors and violence prevention and all of these things, we partnered with Dr. Stoltz. And so his work is embedded in there to not only have a program that is oriented at violence prevention through behavior recognition, but also through improving the mental health and wellness of our kids so that they're better problem solvers, which keeps them away from not only that path of violence, but keeps them hopefully away from that path of suicide or despair, because they understand more the scope of their problems, the reach or extent of their problems, the endurance of their problems. And so it's a key partnership for us, and that critical content from literally, I think, the world's premier expert in adversity and resilience is embedded throughout all of this other behavioral recognition content that we've put together.
If I may ask, and this is obviously a difficult topic because especially in the higher education, there's a lot of literature out there that, like essentially the 18 to 22-year-old has lost the individual's capacity to deal with adversity. Like you get a B- on a test or something and you lose your mind. Your roommate in college calls you a bad name and you're like, we'll flip out. You call 911, right? To what degree, and I don't know if you can make comment on this, but to what degree does developing resilience and capacity to manage adversity in young people play into removing their parents from being the problem solvers in their lives?
Yeah, it's huge. And it's also relatively simple and I think pretty retainable. So Dr. Stoltz, we have a training. It's early on in our program. Basically, our program is follows the school year. It's a month by month. Sure. It's a digital platform that provides for either schools or organizations a monthly training video on these key topics, on behavior recognition, on those kinds of things. But to answer your question, what Dr. Stoltz teaches is what he calls CORE. So CORE, control. So the first thing you say is, what extent can I control what's happening to me? And most oftentimes we can't control our circumstance, but we can control how we respond to that circumstance. And the O is ownership. Okay, what part of this can I own and impact? And then the R is reach. How far? And this is where the kids really get out of whack. Like they'll.
Are you feeling that? There's an earthquake.
Yeah.
Look at the water. We're just gonna, I guess, roll through. Yeah. I was gonna, when you were talking about prevention initially, when you said, we can actually predict these things, it immediately made me think about it's still going. That's how hard we are. We're just rocking through a broadcast while an earthquake's rolling. It immediately made me think about like, okay, well, there's always been discussion about predicting earthquakes within San Francisco. And after the fact, people always say, okay, like these are the things, right? These are the important pieces, but it's not relevant if you can't meaningfully engage these predictive mechanisms beforehand. Right. But again, you already addressed that. So I'm sorry, you were saying?
I was talking about reach. So that's where a lot of our young people, I got a C on a test. They think that's the end of my
right.
So he teaches them, no, that's one thing. That's one thing in the totality of your whole life.
Right.
So it teaches perspective. And then the E of CORE is endurance. How long is this hardship going to last? And so think about that. We teach these to teach anyone those things that what can I control? What part of ownership do I have in this? How long? What's the reach of it? How long is it going to, how big of an impact is it? And how long is it going to last? That endure piece is a way, it's a methodology for dealing with the daily dose of adversity. And if people can learn to say, oh, I can control how I respond to my adversity, I can foresee how long it's going to last and what my piece of it is, that's a pretty positive thing. And so we've embedded that as going way upstream in terms of prevention. And to answer your question, I think it's a huge help if I have children that learn to be problem solvers without me as a parent having to intercede, then I think there's a positive benefit. For sure.
Right. Yeah. And Gladwell's book, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book where he coined the term favorable disadvantages. And the big piece was, he's like, listen, by all accounts, a single parent household should have overwhelming detriment to the kid. And it does. Yeah. Like single parent households are not as positive as dual parent households.
Yeah.
But if you successfully get a kid through a single parent household and get them functioning in the world, they will likely be far better problem solvers, far more resourceful, because the single parent just flat out did not have the capacity to deal with all of the problems. Whereas the dual parent household, you have a much higher probability that one of the parents is going to be able to step in and assist you in a multitude of ways.
Yeah.
Which again is an interesting thing that plays into this. I recognize you have limited time here. I know this is a work day for you. Is there anything we've missed? Is there anything you want to touch on in closing?
Well, I just hope that people will be open to this philosophy of understanding the problem in its totality before we implement these solutions, because there's a massive push right now to spend a tremendous amount of resources, and I applaud those who are trying to find those resources and dedicate those resources to the safety of our children and our organizations. But I would also, anybody who will hear this and can get this message out, the frustration that I have and where I think we're making some mistakes is again, not to negate. I look at this as a three-legged stool. Prevention is one leg, preparation is the other, and response is the third leg. The stool doesn't function without all three legs. All three legs are necessary and important parts of supporting that stool. It's just that that prevention leg pretty much has been non-existent, and it shouldn't be. We're 25 years post-Columbine. We know enough to know how to do this, and we need to talk about what does the evidence show us. We can make our junior high schools and our high schools the hardest targets in the world, but it will not prevent the attacks from happening. It may diminish the impact of those attacks. Let me go back to one other statistic from the Secret Service study. In that 10-year period of school attacks that they analyzed, how many attacks do you think were ended or stopped by law enforcement responding from off campus?
Oh, very few. Isn't it predominantly that the individual takes the individual's life?
So in their study, the number was 0. So in a 10-year period, not a single school attack was resolved by law enforcement responding from off campus. About 15% of these attacks were resolved by an SRO who was physically present. That's another hugely key piece of data, because you have all these efforts, let's get there and pull the trigger faster. But the duration of these attacks is such, close to 70% of these attacks are over either by intervention from participants, not participants, but potential victims, or by the shooter's own volition. About 40% take their own life. So it's not quite as high as you think. But the point is, these happen very, very fast. So your average law enforcement time, across the country is about 3 minutes. In some areas, it's 30 minutes. It could be 7 or 8 minutes. It just depends. But the point is, the thought that law enforcement will get there and end the problem, and there's a huge amount of resources being devoted to just that piece of this. You've got companies that have created AI that sees a gun and calls the police automatically, and those kinds of things. Again, is anybody looking at the data? This is hard data. You can't deny it. So in a 10-year period from 2009 through 2018, not a single school attack was resolved by law enforcement responding from off campus. They were over before they got there. So all of these efforts in response, let's get there faster, let's pull the trigger faster, let's put more guns in the schools. All of these things need to be considered in light of what the evidence tells us. And I guess that's my biggest, I think it's just a tragedy that we have the evidence to tell us, and I'm not naive that we can prevent every one of these things from happening, but we can certainly, unquestionably, prevent quite a number of them from happening.
And when you take into account that a tangential benefit is you could potentially reduce the number of teen and adolescent suicides, I'll take that too.
100, yes. So the unintended side benefits are substantial. We have safer children, we have happier children, we have more resilient children. Who wouldn't want that? Now, we'll spend $2 million fortifying our school, but we won't spend $20,000 to put a program like this in place, which is much more likely to keep a tragedy from happening than anything else. And so that's really what I would leave with, is that I'm passionate about this. I left the FBI early to pursue this because it's a message that just what does the discussion become after every tragedy?
Gun control.
Gun control. That's all we talk about. I don't care where you fall on the spectrum of gun control or the Second Amendment. the gun is the tool. And we have all of these other things that we should be discussing that we aren't discussing, and we have solutions available to us based on some of the best research in existence. And it's been what's interesting is that the Department of Education came up with the same results, with the Secret Service, as did the Department of Defense, as did Homeland Security, as did the FBI. So all of these entities have independently looked at this based on various incidents over a space of time, and all of them have arrived at the conclusion that behavioral threat assessment is the best preventative measure that exists.
Right.
But it's not mandated. It doesn't, we mandate all of these things, but we won't mandate a threat assessment team in our schools.
Right. And again, even within Idaho, I've been speaking with a lot of people about school security. No one has brought this up.
No
one has mentioned it. It's fast response times. It's having, roaming SROs. It's having teachers armed. It's everything else except this.
Yeah. So,
well, listen, thank you for explaining this.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of things that you've said here where like my head kind of exploded inside the headphones was substantial. Thank you for what you're doing. I'm actually really optimistic about this. I've never had somebody lay it down in this way, saying, hey, look, we can do these things. Everyone acknowledges we can do these things. We just have to have the will to do these things.
Right.
And we have to have the education, because that's ultimately what it seems is at stake here, which is educating people that more bulletproof glass, more guns on campus, all of these things. At some point, we have to look at the people that are the ones that are getting to the stage in their life where they're considering this type of action.
Right.
Preventing that last step and helping people along the way seems to be by far the best thing that I've ever heard.
I couldn't agree with you more. And think of the positive impact of saying, I've talked to thousands of people over the course of, I've been doing this for many, many years. And just when you share this message with them, when I, after I give a presentation or teach a class, just that sense of relief that I didn't know that. You mean there is something I can do? I can exert some control. And that's just simply handing them a quick reference guide that lists all the behaviors. And even doing that has been beneficial. But to go in and into our schools and our organizations and say, let's take just a little bit of time. Let's take 5 minutes a month to work on this. And the end result of that, I think, would be just remarkable. The benefits across the board at a fraction of the cost of all of these other measures. And I just don't know why we aren't approaching it that way. That let's keep up. Yes, we want secure schools. Yes, I want them to be prepared. And when I talk about preparation, you're talking about mass casualty kits. You're talking about emergency response plans and physical
SROs,
all
the
of
whole
that.
thing.
Yeah, I've spoken at multiple SRO conferences. There's a push to put an SRO in every school. I would support that. It's a huge cost, but I would support it. An SRO is a much more important piece than just putting a gun on your average person, because an SRO is a vital part of that school community and there's tremendous benefits from SRO programs. So what I'm saying today doesn't negate any of those other things. It's just that historically we've ignored the prevention piece, and I'm here to say let's stop ignoring that prevention piece. Knowledge is power. Let's take some power. Let's take some control. Let's own this and see what the benefits are from doing that.
Beautiful. On that note, thank you for coming, sir.
Yeah.
I hope first of many, and anything I can do to help you.
Thank you.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.